Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, and friends. Thank you for your participation today. Webinar Fossil Free Reimagining Clean Energy in a Carbon Constrained World, a book authored by Suman Sinha, which is about the past, present, and future of world's energy system in the context of world's changing climate and spells out a playbook to create a carbon light future for India. More than ever before, we are closely examining the use of Earth's resources and its ecosystem. Today, we have an interesting fireside chat between our CEO of BNP Paribas India, Aymar, and Sumant Sinha, Chairman and Managing Director of Renew Power. Sumant is a leading first generation entrepreneur. He is the founder of Renew Power, one of India's largest clean energy company. Sumant founded Renew Power in January 2011 with a clear vision to transform the way energy is produced and consumed in India. Since then, under his leadership, the company has grown exponentially and is today one of India's premier renewable energy company with an aggregate portfolio of more than 10 gigawatt spread over 100 cities. A passionate advocate for solutions related to climate change, Sumant is a co-chair of Electricity Governors Group and a member of Stewardship Board on shaping the future of energy at the World Economic Forum. Chair of the Climate Group's India Advisory Board and CII's Renewable Energy Council and a member of the Advisory Council of India Climate Collective. He is a board member of the US India Strategic Partnership Forum and Senior Vice President of ASSOCHAM. Aymar is CEO of BNP Paribas India. Prior to coming to India, Aymar was the head of territory for Vietnam and CEO from 2015 to 2019. With more than 30 years of banking experience across different geographies and sectors, Aymar brings a wealth of managerial experience and business knowledge. He also brings with him an insightful understanding of corporate needs to bring strong financial support and financial health. Today, we'll start with a short video about the book written by Sumant, followed by the chat between Aymar and Sumant, and then the floor will be open for Q&A. One important announcement, the top 10 participants who ask the most interesting question during the webinar will also receive a personally signed copy of the book from Sumant. Can we have the video, please?
Fossil fuels have been our primary source of energy for over 200 years. The Industrial Revolution was driven by extensive use of coal to generate power through steam, while the discovery of oil in large quantities added yet one more fossil fuel to our energy matrix. What impact did the increasing usage of fossil fuels have on the environment? In one word, it was simply devastating. Unnatural climatic conditions, increased frequency of natural calamities, cities choked by pollution, are some of the byproducts of fossil fuel usage. The biggest threat to our survival comes from global warming caused by carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels and the resultant climate change. In a symbolic portrayal of what our future may hold, Iceland held a funeral to mark the death of the first glacier which melted due to climate change. The big question now is, can we replace fossil fuels and move towards a carbon-free world? Can the sun and the wind power our energy needs? And can we stop this inevitable march of climate change? I feel that is eminently possible. And my book charts a clear roadmap to such a fossil-free world. Clearly, clean energy will have to be the key. Man-made greenhouse emissions were highest due to energy generation by fossil fuels. So quick adoption of solar and wind energy can help bring down these emissions. To give you an example, residential solar or rooftop solar installations alone offer a potential capacity of 15 gigawatts, Similarly, rooftop installations by commercial and industrial customers can offer a capacity of almost 60 gigawatts. That's not all. Hard to abate sectors like cement and steel need to use solar energy and wind energy in their manufacturing processes. And the auto sector needs an aggressive electric vehicle rollout plan. The real game changer, however, will be utility scale solar and wind projects, which are bringing down carbon emissions across the world. But will this transition be affordable? And can a developing country like India bear the cost? The answer is an emphatic yes. In my book, I analyze real-time data and show how cheap renewable energy has become. To give you a small example, tariff-based competitive bids to supply power are being won by clean energy companies at prices lower than 3 rupees per unit of electricity. In dollar terms, only around 4 cents a unit. Renewables have yet another big benefit. They make us less dependent on imported fossil fuels. Growth in this sector will have a direct impact on the economy, boosting jobs, creating new entrepreneurs, and expanding our country's manufacturing capacity. Our company recently announced plans to manufacture solar modules and cells in India by investing about 2,000 crore rupees. And I'm sure that many of our other companies in the sector are planning to do the same. My book attempts to capture this huge transition happening across the globe and in India and create a playbook for a carbon light India. You can order fossil free on Amazon.
Okay, I think this is my turn. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Sumant, many thanks to take some of your precious time to share with us. And I'm very proud and very to be able to have this discussion with you. You are a very well-known personality, as Ganeshan said. I have prepared a few questions. I think you have already covered them through this very small movie. Nevertheless, I think it would be very interesting for all of us to hear it a bit more. I love the way that you are putting the perspective coming back to the past on the new challenge we are facing, because one way or the other, you are saying we have done it in the past, we should be able to do it in the future. So my first question is, you have been a very interesting historical perspective. You have given a very interesting historical perspective of the current transition by talking about two energy transition in the past, the first being from muscle to power, to coal and steam, and the second being oil and cars. You call rise of renewables the third transition, where coal and oil are being replaced, which I think is a very good news. Are you surprised with the pace of the change, and what do you expect to see in the next 10 years?
Yeah, thank you, Aymar, and I'd like to thank you and BNP Paribas and Ganeshan for inviting me for this conversation. You know, fossil-free future is very close to my heart, and therefore having an opportunity to talk about it to a wider audience is always something that I'm passionate about, and therefore whenever I get the opportunity, I embrace it as much as I can. Because this is a very important area for us. It's an important area for humanity. It's an important area for the world as a whole. And you know, let's talk about the question that you asked, which is the issue of energy transitions. Now, we've had, you know, as I said in my book, a couple of energy transitions earlier. First, of course, the very first time we started using or generating energy was in some ways through fire. Or through our own physical means of pushing things or carrying things and so on. But during the first energy transition, therefore, happened when we moved from that into, in some ways, coal. And coal became a predominant source of fuel in the 19th century or thereabouts. And really 18th centuries when it started off with steam pumps and so on, and 19th centuries when it really, you know, became much more predominant. So that whole century, you know, that transition was playing out. And then after that, you know, in some ways, there was an overlapping transition when oil was discovered, and then oil became, you know, came into modern civilization, but in a slightly different area of usage, which was really the area of mobility. And so mobility, in a sense, got started off with the discovery of oil. Um, and then oil and coal kind of coexisted in parallel with each other for many decades, really all the way till recently, till let's say the early 2000s, when it was really coal for heating and generating power, and oil also for heating sometimes, but also increasingly and mostly for mobility. So these are the two kinds of energy sources that were existing. And then renewables has come in, um, and now it's, as we know, it's going to move forward very rapidly, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. Uh, but everything is now happening in the modern world in fast forward speed, almost, especially compared to earlier times. And so we won't have this transition play out over the next 100 years. It'll play out literally over the next 20, 30 years. And so in a way, we are living in a third energy transition, or an energy transition of the kind that humanity has seen only twice before. This is the third time we're seeing it. And so in that sense, it's a once in a generation or a once in a lifetime kind of a change in the energy landscape that we're witnessing. And because it's happening so rapidly, and it's going to happen so rapidly, therefore it's going to be extremely intense and extremely exciting to live through it for all of us. The other interesting thing is that even though it's happening so rapidly around us, it's hard for us to touch it and feel it and really come to grips with it. And part of the reason that I wrote the book is because I operate in the sector, I can see it happening, but I don't see that same level of understanding and awareness in the broader society around us. And so in that sense, the purpose of the book was to try to get this to a wider audience. The fact that we are living through such a seminal change in our evolution as a race. So that is, I think, one way in which this whole energy transition is different from the earlier energy transitions. The second and very critical way in which it is different is that the earlier energy transitions were brought on entirely because of commercial reasons. So oil gave us mobility, coal was denser as a fuel, and therefore it was able to give us certain things. Nobody cared about the carbon aspect of it. But today, we all know that carbon is incredibly important for all of us. And how, every kg of carbon that we put into the atmosphere is going to stay there for the next 100 years and is going to cause global warming. And so therefore, this energy transition is going to have a totally different layer or facet to it, which is the issue of dealing with climate change. And so while it is now being driven also by commercial elements, as were the previous energy transitions, it is also going to be driven and started getting driven by this whole issue of climate change, which is in some ways differentiates or separates this particular energy transition from the ones that we've had in our history, actually.
And I think you have done a very good job, because I believe you, as a leader on this topic, like other people, have turned governments to now understand that there is a potential creation of value and jobs. And indeed, it's not only being careful on our planet. And that there is some very well-known politicians who have been skeptical. And I think you have done an amazing job. In your discussion with government, you feel that indeed now they fully understand the value that can be created through the transition?
So, I think different politicians react to it differently. And you alluded to some who react in a very different manner, unfortunately. But I would say, as far as India is concerned, I would say the current dispensation has been very proactive about recognizing the imperative of climate change. And till about 6-7 years ago, India had this very dual kind of mindset about renewable energy. On the one hand, we were pushing it forward because we realized it was the right thing to do. And till about 3-4 years ago, renewables was more expensive than conventional power. So it had to be given some form of subsidization or incentivization from the government, which the government was doing. So they were therefore being smart enough about it to recognize that push had to be given. But at the same time, they wanted to continue to have India's position on climate change issues be such that the stance was that, look, we didn't cause the climate change problem, and therefore don't look to us for solutions. You, the Western world, caused the problem. Therefore, you, the Western world, go and find the solution for it. And don't look to us. We are a developing country. On a per capita basis, all our numbers look very low. And so therefore, we are not to be blamed, and therefore, we're not going to find the solution. But I think the change that I see in this government now is that not only is it very actively encouraging renewable energy, but at the same time, they've also taken the view that, look, the world is a single boat and we're all in that same ship. We cannot now erect walls or create barriers, right? It's unlike COVID. In COVID, you can create barriers and say, you can't fly into my country. You can't do that with climate change. You can't tell the atmosphere not to come in. You can't tell currents, you can't tell wind not to come into your country, because it will happen. So I think that's a recognition that the Indian government has come to. And the fact that India is a vulnerable country as far as climate change issues are concerned. And therefore, we can't just sit outside the sidelines waiting for others to find a solution. We have to be part of that solution finding aspect as well. And so I think that's a very significant change that the Indian government has taken. And I think that is really being driven by, I think, more enlightened policies on the part of the Indian government. So at least I would say in India, the government certainly is moving in the right direction, has moved in the right direction. But, in other parts of the world, support for climate change issues is still very spotty. And as we saw in the last 4 years, we took a huge step back globally because of the actions of certain countries. And that is really the big fear that one has now, that despite climate change being such a massive imperative that 99% of the world recognizes, it's that 1% of the world's population that can vote for certain people who will then take totally adverse actions on climate change issues.
Sumant, if, and this could happen because you are a very well-known expert on the topic, if you would have a prime minister of developing countries who were knocking on your door and would ask you, please advise me what I should do based on your own experience, and I think the good job which has been done in India on the last years, what would be your main advice?
Well, so let me just take a step back and talk about the whole issue of carbon emissions, right? And then I'll link it to the commercial aspect as well. But see, carbon is basically getting emitted to the atmosphere from basically, I would say, 25% is coming from non-energy sources, okay, agriculture, those kinds of things, and 75% comes from energy. Of the energy that is generating carbon, 25% of that 75%, right? So when I say 25%, I mean a third of energy comes from electricity generation. The balance comes from heating and other industrial applications and mobility. That's another big contributor to carbon emissions. Now, today, the good news is that renewable energy is providing a solution for the 25% that is coming from the electricity sector of carbon emissions. We are not there yet. Renewables are still a small percentage of overall electricity generation, but at least we know that over the next 10, 20 years, it's going to become a much bigger part. And over maybe 30 to 40 years, it will entirely replace any fossil fuel-based electricity generation, and therefore will be entirely responsible for that 25%. So that will become largely carbon-free. But it's the balance, it's the other 50% of energy generation that is left over that we really have to think about. And in that, we have to make sure that mobility, which is about a half of that, gets moved very quickly into electricity, and then electricity itself becomes decarbonized. So I think we need to deepen electrification into the balance of the energy mix. That is very critical. So electric vehicles, maritime, how can we look at ships having batteries as well? Civil aviation, which is another big contributor. So all of those new technologies we require. We need rapid deployment, development and deployment of new technologies. So that is a very critical aspect. And then I think we have to look at the hard to abate sectors, which are called hard to abate because, replacing the carbon emissions there is a little bit more difficult. For those, we need to just specify standards and say that, look, you Mr. Cement Company, or you, Mr. Steel Company, now have to convert your cement or your steel into green cement or green steel, and we're going to start measuring you against that, right? So I think that's the kind of standards that need to be set across multiple industries, driven through the government, for us to migrate very rapidly towards, green electricity and electricity becoming a bigger part of the energy mix. Now, one simple way of doing that is to start pricing carbon. Today, unfortunately, we don't have good pricing for carbon. So pricing carbon, where everybody who emits carbon realizes that there is a cost to it. You can't just dump it into the atmosphere, right? And therefore, if you're going to use the limited pool of space left in the atmosphere for carbon, then you're going to have to pay for it. And once you start doing that, then people will become a lot more sensitive about their carbon usage. And that's what is going to then result in much more technology and interventions on bringing down the carbon emissions. And then that money can also be used for doing the research that is required. So I think a carbon tax is not really a bad idea. And I think developing countries and developed countries all should be thinking about that very seriously right now.
Thank you, Sumant. In your book, you talk about DER, and I'm going to read it to ensuring that I'm not making a mistake. So, distributed energy resources. And you mention it as a huge potential for India. Could you elaborate your thoughts on DER and its potential to transform renewable adaptation in India?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the great characteristics of renewable energy is that unlike a coal plant, where you have to set up at least 1,000, 2,000 megawatts at a time, you need a lot of land, and of course, you spew a lot of carbon and other pollutants into the atmosphere. The great thing about renewable energy is that you don't have to set up 1,000 megawatt solar farm. You can actually set up a 10 kilowatt solar on your rooftop. And the cost of generating that 10 kilowatts is not that much more than the cost of setting up a 1,000 megawatt solar farm somewhere very far away. And because of that facet and that characteristic, the opportunity exists for every single consumer to also become a producer of power. Now, what you require for that is essentially the ability of the grid to increase the flow, the bidirectional flow of power. So not only will consumers then be taking power from the grid, but wherever they produce power on their rooftops, they should have the ability of putting power back into the grid. So it does require a lot of intervention at the grid level. But the reality is, if you can actually, and what I've tried to do is I've tried to look at all the cities of India, all the industrial, the small industrial clusters in India, all the commercial buildings and so on. And I've tried to make an assessment of if all the rooftop spaces were used, how much capacity could be set up of solar power on rooftops. And the number I came to is about 120 gigawatts, which is about a quarter of India's target for 2030 of total renewable energy deployment. So it's a pretty sizable number. So the benefit of it is twofold. Number one, it'll actually, by letting people produce power on their rooftops, it is actually going to decrease the amount of power they need to get in from the grid. So it'll actually reduce the grid investments. So that is one. And the second thing is that by putting solar panels on rooftops, you can actually start decreasing the amount of heat that homes absorb. And as you decrease the amount of heat that homes absorb, you also will require a lower amount of air conditioning. And therefore, that will actually result in some degree of energy savings as well. So actually putting up 120 gigawatts of this distributed energy resources, essentially on rooftops of factories, commercial complexes, as well as homes, can result in a fairly large capacity and also have a lot of attendant benefits in terms of lower transmission costs and also lower air conditioning costs. And air conditioning actually is meant to be one of the biggest generators of demand consumption or demand growth in India in the electricity sector over the next several years.
Thank you. You have touched bases on the electric vehicle, and I think this is indeed something that is potentially or will become very visible for everybody. I mean, we hope, we dream about it. You also touch points on other industries. You mentioned the cement industry, the steel industry, or we could add the aluminum industry, which we know is consuming lots of electricity, even if we love aluminum because there is a recycling possibility with the aluminum. Can you tell us a bit more on these heavy industries, what we call heavy industries, the way you think that they can join this race of a transition? Because obviously, as you said, everybody should move. Some will move quicker than others, but can we have your point on these heavy industries?
Yeah, so these, in climate change parlance, these industries are called the hard to abate sectors. And there is a very significant push to try to get all of these sorts of companies to start having minimum standards of usage of renewable energy or clean energy in the energy that they consume. Now, there are, of course, certain technical issues involved because they need heat up to a certain point, and whether that can be delivered through electricity or not is a question. There are potential solutions available through solar thermal applications. So there is still a lot of technology work that needs to be done to convert a lot of these industries into consuming renewable or clean energy for their consumption requirements. But there is a lot of work that is going on, and slowly now, wherever there's just basic electricity consumption, that can be very easily replaced. But electricity being used to heat, that I think is going to require, or wherever there's heating done directly, there we need a little bit more work to be done on the technology side to replace those industries fossil consumption. So, but there is a lot of work going on, and I'm pretty hopeful that with some of the new technologies that are emerging, including, by the way, carbon capture, I think we can have a situation where these industries really decrease substantially their carbon emissions.
Thank you. There is a very specific topic which is seen as potentially a blocking point. I would say it's a huge opportunity or a huge challenge, depending how optimistic or not optimistic you are. It's the batteries. So we all would love to see batteries in cars having more capacity and not being recharged so often. We know that there is a limitation in terms of technology. Now let's look at the opportunities. I think your opinion, and thank you to explain it to all the participants, you think that India should and could play an important role in the battery. So what are your advice to the governments to ensure that India will really become a key player in the battery industry moving forward?
Yeah, Ayman, look, the reality is that these are all industries of the future. Solar, wind, of course, are more mature. We all know that battery costs are high right now, but they are coming down rapidly. And countries that can set up manufacturing ecosystems in batteries will have a lot of room to grow those industries over time, lead to a lot of employment generation, and so on. And so, as a country, therefore, India must find a way to take the lead in these areas. Now, it's a little bit hard because while I say that we are still in early days as far as batteries are concerned, other countries have already set up humongous capacities and are expanding at a rapid pace. And it's not just capacities, it's also the investments in the technology side and in future R&D development, in blocking the supply chains for things like rare earths and lithium and so on. So it's not just setting up manufacturing, it's actually getting this whole ecosystem right. Now, the Indian government is really keen to have battery manufacturing becoming much more prevalent in India. As I said, we are late in the game already, but perhaps not as late as we are in some of the other industries, so we must give it a shot. So what we need to do basically is we need to create a local industry and a local demand. Now, that local demand will come from two areas for batteries. Number one is from electric vehicles, and number two is from utility scale storage. But the much larger amount has to come from electric vehicles. So to create the demand, we really need to have a mandate for how many electric vehicles are sold in the country over the next 10, 15 years. And we have to say that at least X percentage of vehicles sold by, let's say, 2030 or 2035 or manufactured by the manufacturing companies have to be electric in nature. And by that mechanism, we have to create demand. And similarly, on the electricity or the utility scale side, we have to again mandate that a certain percentage of renewable energy supply must go through batteries and thereby create demand for batteries on that side as well. So the first thing is demand creation. So that's point number one. Point number two is we have to give certain incentives to companies that want to get into manufacturing of batteries because it has to be done at scale. So that's the second thing we need to do. And the third thing we have to think about is whether we can put up any kind of barriers to imports, whether that is possible from a WTO standpoint or not, I don't know. The government obviously does, and therefore they'll have to examine some of those things. Because you have to find a way to give these Indian companies a chance to grow and capture market share and get to a certain level of scale. And once they've got to scale, then you have to let them compete freely in the marketplace. So I think that's really what you have to do. Now, in doing that, you have to be careful that in giving this protection, you don't get the cost of batteries to a point where the demand side gets hit. So it's a little bit of a delicate balancing role that has to be played by the government. And on the one side, giving support, on the other side, at the same time, making sure that the demand side does not get negatively impacted. So both have to be looked at. So the best solution really is to do what the government is doing, which is to give a production-linked incentive for people who get into the manufacturing of batteries, as they're also looking in the case of solar manufacturing.
Very clear. My last question, Sumant, will be around the financial institution and the banking sector. I mean, you are talking to a banker, so let me be extremely motivated in getting your views on this aspect. I think you could become a banker because you have been on the last year very involved with them. You have raised capital successfully from private equity with banks. You have been on the bond markets. And now I understand from Ganeshan that you have been successfully getting to a merger into a SPAC for a reverse listing. Now, what I would like to know from you is, what do you see as the role of the bank and capital markets? What do you expect from them in the energy transition? Where do you think that they should play an active role? Do you consider what they do today? I'm not talking only on BNP Paribas, even if we believe that we are playing a very key role and we hope that this is visible. But what do you expect from them? What partnership do you expect from them?
Yeah. No, look, I think that's a terrific question because, when you look at the amount of investment required just in renewable energy, and I'll give you some numbers. Today, the total installed capacity of the power sector from all sources globally is 6,000 gigawatts. That's the amount of power generating capacity we have all over the world from every single source. The amount that we have to set up only in renewable energy capacity over the next 20 to 30 years is about 15 to 20,000 gigawatts. So it's about 3 or 4 times the investment that has gone into the entire power sector since the beginning of our history. That has to go in globally into just the renewable energy sector. And I'm not even getting into, a whole bunch of other clean energy areas. Now, this is going to require almost $1 to $1.5 trillion of investment every single year. Now, to give you a sense of magnitude, the total investment that was going into the oil and gas sector globally, and we all know oil and gas had some massive companies, there's this massive geopolitical area. The total amount of investment going into oil and gas was between $500 and $700 billion every year. And the amount going into power sector was only about $250 to $300 billion every year. So the amount that has to go into renewables now is more than oil and gas and power put together every single year. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude of investment that is required. Now, this capital has to come from somewhere. Now, as long as there are good investment opportunities, my conviction is that capital will find its way. But nevertheless, there has to be, people have to sort of channelize that capital. It has to be bankers like you all, right, who have to play very active roles in taking the capital where it is being generated and transferring it to the places where it is required, right? It could be from one part of the world to a totally different part of the world, right? How to make that happen? How to address risk issues when capital moves across boundaries and borders? How to come up with innovative financing solutions? So I think multilaterals have a role to play in that, but multilaterals are small. They are not large enough. The real large pools of capital are dealt with by people like you all, commercial banks, investment banks, and so on. And so therefore, I think, you all have a very, very fundamentally important role to play in being able to identify opportunities and identify capital and bring the two together. And that whole process needs to really be made much more streamlined And if you can do that, I think that would be a tremendous role for capital providers to play.
Job description is very clear, Sumant. We take it. I think you have a very motivated bankers in BNP Paribas, and we have a CEO who has a very clear vision on that. I think there is no disconnect between what you said and the mission we see ourselves. As you said, it's a worldwide issue. There is no border, and there is no nationalities. There is no difference between industries. I think this will be a common success or unfortunately a common failure. And I am a positive person, so I think it will be a common success. Many thanks for answering to my questions. I will leave the floor to the question of the public. I really appreciate the time you have spent with us tonight. And Ganeshan, I leave you back the floor to manage the Q&A. But many thanks, Sumant.
Thank you, Aymar. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Aymar. That was a very interesting discussion. So just a reminder to participants to ask the question. There is a button on your screen. You can type your questions and we will select the questions. So to start with, this is a question from Aman. The question is, while the move to renewables is good, and everyone, the planet and the people living on it will benefit from it. But I think two aspects where I think he wants more clarity. One, there are a number of countries which are still completely reliant on oil or crude, both for their economy as well as, as a source of fuel. So what are your thoughts on, what should those countries do? And the second question is on the disposal of, solar panel battery, because all of these, have a definite life. And is there a problem that will get created 10, 15 years down the line in terms of disposal of these panels and batteries?
Yeah, look, they're both excellent questions. There are, of course, a number of countries that are totally reliant on oil and gas. Those countries have to find ways of diversifying away from oil and gas for their own long-term good. And a number of countries, especially in the Middle East, are actually beginning to do that quite actively. So if you look at some of the Middle Eastern countries, you'll see that they're very actively moving towards clean energy and are beginning to invest in those areas as well. So they're actually, trying to recycle the capital that they're generating away from oil and gas into clean energy. So I think so that is a move that is already happening, at least in a number of countries. Now, of course, there will be some countries that will always be laggards in the space, and frankly, we can't do much about those countries because it is what it is. But certainly, I think the more enlightened countries are moving already in the right direction. Maybe the pace is slow, but I am pretty confident that it will accelerate as we go forward. Because the commercial aspect is going to become stronger and stronger. Now, to come to your second question, as far as disposal is concerned, you're absolutely right. That is a problem which is maybe 20, 25 years away. And so frankly, not a lot of work has happened in that area. And therefore, I can't give you a good answer at this point in time as to how the recycling and disposal will happen, especially when we have massively large quantities. That is something that I'm pretty convinced that, just given the way markets work, good solutions will be found, but because the deployment of those solutions is still so many decades away. By decades I mean at least 20 years away. Therefore I think people will hold off on trying to spend too much time on researching that problem until it's a more imminent issue, and then you'll start probably seeing a lot more research happening, and I'm pretty convinced that solutions will be found. So I don't think that it'll become a big problem, frankly. And in solar modules, there isn't anything that dramatic. It's not like it has any materials that will leak into the soil or anything of that sort that will create any negative repercussions. Yes, in batteries there are, but battery material can get recycled multiple times as well, with decreasing efficiency, but certainly can get recycled quite a few times. So again, that problem can also be pushed out quite substantially.
Understood. The second question is on as renewable becomes more mainstay in India, there obviously will be challenges that come along with that. So what are the steps that need to be taken to overcome some of those challenges, whether it is distribution, whether it is interstate transmission, or whether it just the load fluctuations?
Yeah.
So what do you see as the challenges as renewable becomes a larger percentage of the total energy?
Yeah, so look, that's obviously a great question. And the biggest, I think the biggest problem for the faster rollout of renewables right now in India is really the financial health of the distribution utilities. And in some ways, that's also the biggest opportunity, therefore. If we are able to really deal with the utilities, and the government is doing a number of things in that regard, then it can really speed up the rollout of renewables as well. But to me, that's one big issue that does need to be addressed, to go really fast. The second issue that has to be addressed is, not to my mind, capital, because I think capital can become available. To some extent is policy making, because and this is not just an India issue. This is a global issue, because technology is changing so rapidly that you know uh, not just policymakers, we are also struggling to stay abreast of all the latest things that are happening. And therefore, we're having to change our business models. We're having to change what we can deliver in terms of a product, in terms of intermittency issues and so on. Those costs are changing very rapidly. And so therefore, policy making is going to be under some degree of pressure to make sure that they create the right policies. Because if I invest in a project, that investment has to be valid for the next 25 years. But I know that 6 months later or a year later, that project may be higher cost than what I can get at that point in time. So how do you deal with that, right? So you have to give certainty, and yet in the back of a very rapidly changing technology area. So that's really where policy making is going to be a little bit challenged. And to me, the biggest issue actually is going to be the physical issue of implementing the large capacity of renewables that we need to implement in India. It means a tremendous amount of land acquisition, a tremendous amount of grid build out, a tremendous amount of equipment sourcing, hundreds of thousands of people to be trained, to be sent to sites, equipment to be moved, logistics to be prepared. All of that is going to take a lot of effort as well. So I think just the ability to organically build out all these assets, that is going to be pretty critical as well. And that could also be a constraining factor, actually.
Thank you. There is a related question, which he calls the peak load puzzle. So, clearly, renewable is generated during the day, and a lot of the, as you said, air conditioning usage, etc., is peaks during the night. So, how do you, with renewable, how do you manage this peak load puzzle?
So, this is again where technology is evolving in the right direction, right? So there was a bit last year where, and in fact, let me just take a step back. That the solar generation profile is it peaks in the daytime at 2 or 3 o'clock, and then it suddenly goes off in the evening, right? So it doesn't meet the evening peak power consumption. Wind, on the other hand, goes up and down, up and down, up and down over the course of the day and night, and it's hard to forecast. And it is also seasonal. And therefore, when the monsoon winds blow, demand goes down and more wind is being generated. And so in some senses, therefore, how do you align it with the demand consumption? So you need to do a couple of things. Number one, you need to have time of day pricing so that you're able to move around the demand profile itself. Today, we don't move around demand profile at all. It's because you don't have time of day pricing. So that is the first thing that we need to do. Okay. The second thing that we need to do is we need to start combining different renewable energy sources together. And when you do that, you start having more even load curves, which are more forecastable as well. Okay. And then you can, on top of that, interpose batteries and thereby move for a few hours here and there the generation curve. And by doing all of that, you can actually make it match the demand curve, which also you can move through time of day pricing, and actually have a very flexible grid where you don't have, this very fixed demand curve, right? And very fixed generation profiles. And so you really need to have a very flexible mindset about how you are going to move all of this around to make it match between the two at the lowest possible cost. It's eminently doable. And let me tell you guys that last year there was a bid called by the Indian government where we were required to deliver an 80% plant load factor um, through only clean energy sources. We were able to deliver that at a price which was 30% cheaper than coal-based power. And it was delivering an 80% plant load factor over the course of the year. So it was almost firm power and at significant cost reduction to coal-based pricing. So I think now all those things are becoming possible. And so I think technology is there, the solutions are there. It's now just a question of implementing the whole thing and making it come together at the aggregate national level. But fundamentally, the solutions are there.
Yeah, and I think one follow-up question which came is, have you seen examples of countries where renewable has been used as a base load, and where do you think India is on that path?
Yeah, see, the concept of base load itself is outdated, because as I said, if you can move demand around, right? Then what is the concept of base load? In fact, if you ask me that if I have a plant that has to operate at a certain minimum size, that's sort of standard, then that's actually even more inflexible than renewables, which can potentially be stored a little bit and the power can be moved here and there. So if I look at coal-based plants, usually coal-based plants cannot be operated at below 55% efficiency or plant load factors.
Yeah.
So yes, they do provide a certain base load and obviously dispatchability. But at the same time, if the load falls below 55%, then you actually have a serious technical problem as well. So I think every generating source has its own characteristics. But as I said earlier, the key issue that you have to now use to manage grids is the issue of flexibility. And you have to build in a lot of flexibility into grid management. You need to have storage-based solutions. You need to have demand response systems for which you need to have net metering. You need to have the ability of shifting the power load around. In India, we have a single national grid, so we can move power from one part of the country to another part of the country. So all of those things are very essential. And so I think the concept of baseload power is now no longer as relevant as it used to be earlier.
Thank you. Maybe just shifting to another aspect. The question is CNI or a distributed model going to play a larger part of the total renewable mix in India? And is the government doing enough in terms of financial or other support for this?
Sure. So look, there are two types of CNI customers. One set of CNI customers is when you do an installation in situ, so either on their rooftop or in their premises. Those are usually small in size and therefore will meet only a certain small amount of their requirements. But as I said earlier, if you add all of that up, right, and if you look at residential as well, it still does come to a pretty sizable number, right? But there is no real business model at this point for residential rooftop installations, because residential power, as you know, in India is subsidized. And so therefore, full cost solar is still more expensive than subsidized power, which a lot of people get at no price at all. So therefore, that is a little bit of an prohibitor for installation of a large amount of residential rooftop solutions. But CNI on premises is possible. And that, as I said, I think adds up to about 30-40 gigawatts of total capacity that can be done. But the real CNI opportunity is if you use the grid, you set up the CNI or the capacity somewhere, and you use the grid to supply power into the CNI customer. Now, in India, there are all sorts of charges that you have to pay for using the grid, and correctly so. There's no issue. Obviously, if you're using the grid, you should pay for it. But what we're finding is that now, even if you add those grid charges, the cost of supplying through renewables is becoming cheaper. And so more and more what you'll start seeing is CNI customers moving to procure renewables directly from people like us. And that's, I think, something that is going to become a much bigger opportunity going forward.
Thank you. The next question is probably from somebody who's looking to come to India. So the question is, what are the key success factors in India for developing and growing a renewable business? I think the question implies greenfield acquisition. What would you recommend for somebody coming in now?
So, there are two ways to come into and get capacity in the Indian market. One is that you have very low return expectations and you just come in and you can acquire some capacity that has already been set up. Just to come in, do due diligence, hire advisors, write a check, get the capacity. You may not get the best return in the world, but certainly you'll get capacity in India. The second way is to actually set up your own execution team. Now, that's not that easy because this is India after all, and executing projects on the ground in India is pretty damn difficult. Okay, but that's the other way of doing it. And then you start, you set up an execution team, you go and acquire land, you do your own procurement and construction, and you participate in auctions that the government comes out with. And it's a fairly transparent process, very easy to participate in those tenders. And then you can come in and set up your own capacity yourself. So you make a few, a little bit higher returns in that, but it's a lot harder to do. And I can tell you that it is a lot harder because you've learned over the last 10 years with a lot of sweat and tears and blood how hard it is.
Yep, absolutely. Then coming, I think, to the area of manufacturing, the question is, and as you said, there is, while we have done a lot, there is probably 2 or 3x more to be done in the next decades. Mm-hmm. So manufacturing of solar panel modules in India, do you see the future for that? What are the key challenges, enablers that you would think about?
So, this is a policy issue because the government has to take a call on whether they want to keep importing solar modules from China, where, of course, there are trade issues as well as now geostrategic issues, or whether we want to be more self-dependent and not replace one kind of import dependence on oil and gas to a different kind of import dependence to solar panels. One coming from the West mostly, one coming from the East. So I think the government's view on that is quite sensible, which is that they would like to encourage solar manufacturing in India. And for that, they are, as I said earlier, coming out with a production-linked incentive scheme. And that scheme hopefully will give a fillip to manufacturing capacities in the country. And I think that's a positive development.
Thank you. The next question is and something you touched upon, which is regulatory. So, and obviously, as you said, there have been some ups and downs in terms of regulation, whereas an industry like this needs a long-term investment view and therefore stability of regulation. So, so based on your experience, what would you recommend to potential investors on the stability of regulations as you have seen it or experienced?
In India, particularly?
Yes.
So, as I said, everywhere in the world, policymakers are trying to come out with policies in a rapidly changing environment. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't get it so right. I think that's part of our business, and so I think therefore to expect to have everything very well articulated and laid out for you over the next 10, 20 years, that's very hard to have happen. I think you have to get engaged. You have to continuously have dialogues with the government. You have to see what they're thinking. You have to have the ability of giving them your own views. And then whatever are the policies that emerge, you have to be able to orient your business accordingly. So I think you have to just be practical about it.
Sure. The next question touches a bit on the financing aspect. So, obviously, as you said, banks, financial institutions play a key role. But to encourage or promote renewable sector more, do you think it's wise to consider a positive incentive for financing things which are green? And on the same token, should there be kind of a penalty for something which is not green? Have you seen that in any other country, and should India be thinking about that?
I haven't seen any penalties for financing anything that is green, and for that is not green, unfortunately. Maybe there should be. I don't know how that will work though. Will bankers be docked a certain penalty 10 basis points or whatever you lent because it happened to be to certain sectors which were not on the approved list of green investments. I don't know if that's possible or not. That I guess various regulators and governments will have to see globally. Is there anything that can be done if people lend to green sectors? I think the way it's going to work is if the investing community starts rewarding people who invest or devote more attention span to green activities and less attention span to non-green activities. And I think that is beginning to happen. ESG investing has become a much bigger theme now globally. Many large investors have vowed that they are going to invest more in companies that have green policies and a green philosophy in place, which is also why a number of banks, I'm sure like you all as well, have put in place, or come out publicly with a number of targets about how much green financing, that they're going to do. So I think that's how the market is going to reward people with higher valuations if you do certain, if you do green financing, and not reward you if you don't do green financing. I think that's the way the differentiation is going to begin to emerge. It's going to be more on the equity valuation side than anything else. As far as we are concerned, Bayu, let me tell you that on the debt financing at least, I have not seen any benefit of lower cost. So for example, we do green bonds, or actually all the bonds that we do are green bonds. I cannot say that we are seeing a 25 basis points or a 50 basis points cheaper cost because we are investing all of that into green activities. I have not seen that yet. It may happen at some point in the future.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time. There are more questions, but we'll get them answered separately, I guess. So Sumant, thank you very much for giving this time. It was a very engaging discussion, and this topic is something which is quite central to BNP Paribas. So thank you for doing this with us, and thank you, Aymar, for the wonderful questions.
No, and thank you, Ganesh, and thank you, Aymar, and thank you, BNP Paribas, so much for giving me this opportunity. As I said, this is a topic close to my heart. It's a topic that is incredibly important for all of us as a whole. So I'm really glad that you're giving it this level of prominence and visibility. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.